First of all, thank you all for coming and good afternoon. My name is James Burrows. I'm the Chief Inclusion Officer for the state of Minnesota, and I'm the governor's representative leading the work of the Governor's Law Enforcement and Community Relations Council. I want to say who's ever has a close connect to who can control the weather, tell them to make it stop snowing, and we'd get more people out here, but in spite of that, I'm thankful for you all coming out. I'm going to speak just a very brief moment about how we got here today as far as the council, and then also the work that the council is doing. Most of today's session will be led by folks who are leading the work to kind of get your feedback and input on the recommendations that are put forth by the council to the governor's office. I want to say this: a lot of times when you have these community listening sessions or feedback, folks have already made a decision. They're just telling you what they're going to do, and they're going to just let you write some stuff down, and that's it. That's not the purpose of today's meeting. Today's meeting is to get feedback, not only on the recommendations you will hear from the council, but also, too, more importantly, if you have other ideas, thoughts, and things that you're aware of that we should be looking at, please bring those to our attention as well. If you didn't get a chance to, the copy of the governor's executive order creating the council is in the back, I believe, and then also too, listing of all the council members are there as well. There are 15 official members of the council, and there are 17 ex officio members for a total of 32. I'm one of the ex officio members, and if you want that information, we have that for you as well. What I wanted to do is kind of take you through how the council, or why the council was created, and then get to the gist of the meeting. As you all know, in July of last year, there was a fatal shooting in Falcon Heights of Philando Castile. And after that shooting, my role in the governor's office and others in the governor's office changed for about 3 to 4 weeks straight. We met at the governor's residence, and we as you know, there were many protests outside the governor's residence, and there were folks that we met with on a regular basis. Some of those included a lot of the protesters were invited in. We talked to them about what reforms needed to change. We talked to a lot of law enforcement organizations as well as judicial organizations, prosecutors as well. And what we found out was we needed to have some mechanism where everybody would get at a table in a room and talk about things that we can do as far as solutions moving forward. In doing that, the governor created the Governor's Council of Law Enforcement and Community Relations, and that council was established in October of last year. Once the council was established, we began having meetings of the council and also the ex officio members. We've had to date, somebody raised their hand, I want to say 7 or 8 meetings of the council. And in addition to those 8 meetings, you'll have subgroups that I'll talk about a little bit later that have met outside of the council as well to do some of the work. And those council meetings have pretty much been attended by not only council members, but members of the public as well. As we were doing those meetings, we realized too, though, we wanted to get more members of the public involved and get their feedback and input. So this today, going forward, we're going to have about 3 to 4 listening sessions like these moving forward, so more members can participate as well. Because sometimes the council meetings are during the day. We also too wanted to make sure that people who are affected directly by this, these incidents, were at the table. So the family of Jamal Clark was invited to be on the council, and also the family of Philando Castile. We obviously know there are more people affected or be impacted by this, citizens other than those two. We wanted to make sure that we had representation. Mr. Castile, Clarence Castile, who's the uncle of Philando, has been an active member on the council and has been contributing greatly towards the work we've been doing as well. We have a mix of law enforcement and community, and we also have a mix of elected and non-elected officials as well on the council. One of the things that the executive order talks about is having a state level response. So one of the things that we hope to get out of this is recommendations that go to the governor and legislature will be enacted upon moving forward. So that state level response will be either things that will appear in the future in the governor's budget and recommendations, and or the legislature as well. One of those things that is in the current budget that's in conference committee, I believe, is a recommendation for training for law enforcement on a variety of different issues, procedural justice, unconscious bias, and also too money towards more diversity recruiting for law enforcement as well. That's one of the common ground things that the council not only seem to have unanimous recommendation for, but also to something the legislature found necessary to put forth in the bill. Right now, that bill's in conference committee. It's not final yet, so what happens with it, we don't know, but that is something that did come out of the recommendations of the council as well. So you know as well, the governor recommended in his original budget to the legislature $10 million for training for the council to determine where that money goes to officers for training, and also $2 million for community initiatives, so community partnerships with law enforcement and community organizations as well. As you know about the budget process, whether that money stays in the budget or not, who knows, but there's going to be negotiation. But I just want you to know that initially started the discussion. The recommendations are to look at a variety of things. I won't go through a lot of this in detail because you'll hear about it in the council itself. But one of the things that we found was there was a necessity to rebuild trust, or let me take that back. There was a necessity to establish trust with law enforcement and community. One of the things that you realize you can't do in any negotiation or any partnership or collaboration, if there's no trust at the table, it doesn't matter what folks say or bring to the table. So we realized there was a necessity to establish that trust. That is still a work in progress. That is not something that's going to change overnight. What I realized was when we started this council in October, throughout the country, as you know, many more incidents continue to occur over and over again related to law enforcement, violence against law enforcement, and violence against people in the community, and that continues to this day. But one of the things we want to make sure that we establish is, as you rebuild or as you establish that trust, there are opportunities to rebuild it along the way as you continue to build those relationships. The other thing is focusing on procedure and social justice. There's a lot of work already being done in Minneapolis, I want to say St. Louis Park, some in St. Paul as well, around training around procedural justice, social justice, and also implicit bias. A lot of those trainings have happened already. We're not here as a council to reinvent the wheel, but one of the things we had the council do is hear from a lot of different organizations about what's been working or suggested to work, and also look nationally as well. Some of those things you'll find in the recommendations going forward, and some of those we'd love to hear from you if there's more things that you are aware of as well. Facilitating effective outreach and sustained engagement. If anybody can figure that out and make it a perfect way to do that, we'd love it. But one of the things we realize is there are going to be gaps in this process. One of the gaps that I'm consistently reminded of is sometimes when you have a community meeting, depending on the time you have it, the people that you really want there can't be there because a lot of opportunities of working, childcare, and other things. So we're making sure that in the future we're going to address those as well. In addition to that, one of the recommendations that came back from the NAACP at our meeting 2 meetings ago was, hey, how about you create a Facebook page or create some social media outlets for folks to give feedback even if they can't be present. We did that as well. So there's a Facebook page, the Governor's Council Facebook page, and we will look at creating more social media outlets and email outlets as well. So that's important because I'll be honest with you, in the time that we have, the time that we've had, there's not a lot of time to get feedback from all of Minnesotans, but we want to make sure that there's a way they have access to that. I would be remiss too that we're going to have some community meetings, at least one, in greater Minnesota as well, because we forget sometimes that this is not just an urban issue, it's an issue for all Minnesotans as well. So we'll be having community dialogue there as well. And the goal at the end of the day is to identify, it says best practices on the slide, but I want to more so say it's looking at those things that create opportunities for us to not end up in situations that we've ended up in the past. It doesn't have to be a best practice. It could be a unique opportunity or situation for that particular department, that community that works well. What I shy away from best practices because a lot of people take a best practice and then try to just throw it on top of a situation that is really not meant for that type of practice or that type of community. And we don't want to do that. We want to allow there some adaptation for law enforcement and community to kind of figure out what works best for their community as well. The last thing I'll talk about is the working groups. And the working groups are broken into 5 different groups. Workplace oversight and diversity recruitment, criminal justice, social reform, police training, community law enforcement, health and wellness, policy development and implementation. I'm not going to spend any time going through the detail. As you look at the recommendations, you'll see what those work groups are working on. The last one here, policy development implementation, that group will be responsible for taking all the recommendations once in a final form and identifying what recommendations, let's say, look at from a legislative standpoint. So what are some things that legislatively we need to announce a bill or law for that can have to work? What are some of the recommendations that could be administratively applied by different departments or localities? What recommendations, a third area is what recommendations can be looked at from a statewide level as things such as the Post Board, which oversees licensing for all 10,000 officers. What can they look at and implementing that way? So looking at ways in which to implement these recommendations. I'll be honest with you, the goal is not to have 10 things or 20 things and say we're going to do them all. We're not. My goal and the governor's goal and everybody else's goal is to find some common ground things we can say, these are things that, no matter what side of the aisle that you're on, are good for community, and then let's try to implement those things as well. So that's the ultimate goal as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Omar, who's going to take it from here and talk to you about the process for how we move forward. Thank you.
All right, well, good afternoon. If you think it's still spring, but good evening if we're really in winter. I'm now going to hand over the floor or the stage to our two facilitators, Karen and Jane, and they will basically be taking us forward, garnering your ideas, eliciting your opinions, and getting your feedback. So I'm not going to hog the stage too long. I'll let the two real people come up on stage. So Jane and Karen will be facilitating the rest of the evening or afternoon. Thank you very much.
Just to let you know our process, as Mr. Burrows said, our focus, the main portion of the meeting is about getting your feedback. So there'll be a couple different parts to the meeting. So the first part will be taking a look at the recommendations that were put together by the council and getting your feedback on those recommendations specifically. And we'll ask that at that time that you only come up and give feedback on the recommendations. And again, these were recommendations based on these groups that are listed here. And so the sheet that has the recommendation should look like this. So if you don't have that, then you might want to grab it. So we're going to give you a few minutes to look at that. The second part of the community feedback meeting will be opening it up to more general discussion. So there are people who have signed up to either give a statement or ask a question. So we'll have those people come up first, and then we'll open it up broadly to the rest of the participants in the room. So recommendations, those who have signed up, and then a broader discussion, just so you know. So I think, Jane, did you have anything else to add?
The one thing we ask is, first of all, we're very, very happy that everybody's here. James talked about how we need input from everybody. And the one factor that we ask people is we wish we had hours and hours and hours to speak, but we don't. And so we want to hear from everybody that wants to speak today. So our request is that you keep it to 3 minutes or below, or less. And just remember, we want to give everybody time. So that, I guess, that's probably what we'd like to rather not have to give people
Cut people off.
Yes, exactly. And so we'd like to thank James has done a beautiful job of kind of explaining how we got here and why we're here today. And so, as Karen said, those that signed up to speak, we're going to let them. We've got microphones on both sides of the auditorium that adjust if we need to pull it up or down. And so we let people come up, and then after that, as Karen said, anyone else who has who wants to share your thoughts, because those are very, very important to us at this point.
Any questions before we get started about the process itself? Okay, so let's take, I'm not going to assume that everyone's had a chance to review the recommendations, so let's just take 2 or 3 minutes to read through them. As you're reading through the recommendations, here are some things to consider. We're just calling them reflection questions.
What are your thoughts for those of you that can't see way in the back? What are your thoughts about the recommendations? Do they address your concerns? What, if anything, will work well? And what, if anything, is missing?
These, again, are not comprehensive. If there are other questions or other issues you want to address, specifically, again, with the recommendations at this point, Feel free to do that. This is just to kind of get your mind going as you read through the recommendations. Let's just take a couple minutes for you to read through them. Feel free to jot down any notes that you want to make, and then we'll have you come up to the mics and offer your thoughts.
We also left this up because these were the categories that the committees worked in. And so those were the headings for what they wanted to come up with specifically for each of those headings.
Actually, the headings are on. You can see on the sheet here. Just as an FYI, we do have note takers here, so even though Jane and I you may not see us taking notes, we will be capturing what you have shared. I'm trying to read the room here. I see people who are still reviewing, so we'll give it another minute or two. We'll say 30 more seconds. How's that? Okay. So if there's anyone in particular who has comments, who's ready to come to the mic and offer their thoughts, please do so. And just as a reminder, we're specific to the recommendations at this point. We will have an open discussion a little bit later. The first brave soul.
Is this being taped? Okay. And this will be... Great. And can this be posted on the Facebook page?
At this point in time, we will be recording, we will be sharing the recommendations and outcome of this session.
Right. Can you send the recording to the Facebook page so people who are working right now who can't be here can see it? Great. Thank you. I would just like to read.
Could you please introduce yourself?
My name is Deirdre Darovic, concerned mother. I'd like to just read a letter from Michelle Gross from Communities United Against Police Brutality. This was sent to Mr. Collier about concerns with the process. I think this is worthy of reading so people can know that someone who has been doing this work for 30-plus years has input and has put input and would like to see these things addressed. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here because there was a prior engagement of quite a few people who are in the social justice movement who have a prior engagement of a protest today. So this was posted after that was planned, which is quite unfortunate. I hope that doesn't happen in the future. We thoroughly searched both the governor webpage and the entire state of Minnesota website and have not been able to find a calendar of public meetings for the council. It is our understanding that you stated at the third of 13 meetings that the meeting was noticed as required under the Open Meeting Law, Chapter 13D. While we have no reason to doubt that, this is not the same as publicizing these meetings in a way that allows members of the community to attend meetings and engage with council. In fact, we only learned of the third of 13 meetings about 30 minutes before the start of the meeting. It was unfortunate that one of our members was free to attend. A draft of the preliminary report was presented at that third of 13 meetings with the deadline for input stated as March 15th. This report does not appear to be available via the state website. It is only because of our member was able to pick up a copy of the report at the meeting that we are able to comment on it. Further, the period of time allotted for feedback is wholly inadequate, and the report includes no instructions for providing this input. Feedback on preliminary report. The recommendations in this preliminary report are quite vague, thus providing input is difficult. Nonetheless, we will attempt to provide meaningful input. First, we must express our concern with the general context of the report. The notion of police-community relations is a false framing. This framing proposes that if police and the community could somehow just get along better, trust would be built and the problem would be solved. It also places half the responsibility for the problem on the community. When we have little control over police conduct that undermines trust, what is missing from the preliminary report is any recognition of the need for police accountability. Unless efforts shift from police-community relations to police accountability, the problems that spurred the creation of the council will continue. In fact, if police were held accountable for their actions in meaningful ways, police misconduct would largely disappear and police-community relations would improve on their own with no special efforts needed. It appears from a reading of the preliminary report that the council members have received presentations from 3 government agencies and possibly 1 additional government agency at the third of 13 meeting, according to our member in attendance. There appear to have been no presentations from community organizations. This is a major gap in the information provided in the council and their ability to appreciate the community's perspective on policing. Our organization would be happy to present some of the solutions we have developed and are working toward, and there are a number of other organizations who are similarly able to inform the work of the council. Recommendations by the Workplace Policy and Oversight Diversity and Retention Work Group strive to diversify law enforcement agencies by removing barriers and improving processes for bringing in officers of populations that are currently underrepresented. These are good ideas as more diverse law enforcement agencies tend to be more culturally competent. The recommendation to have new officers complete 20 hours of service in the community has value in that officers may develop more empathy toward members of the community. Many colleges have programs in which students complete service in the community for school credit. Perhaps the council could consider working with the post board to include this in curriculum requirements of law enforcement education programs. The second recommendation of the Criminal Justice and Social Justice...
Can I interrupt you for just a second? I want to make sure that because it looks like you have quite a few pages left.
I don't, actually.
You don't?
I have about
Okay.
5 more paragraphs that I'd really like to
Okay.
read.
Oh, I appreciate it. Just wanted to check in.
The second recommendations of the Criminal Justice and Social Justice Reform Group is to focus on including a special prosecutor in police investigations as a partner to the county attorney, not replacement. This recommendation falls short of what is truly needed an independent special prosecutor with sole responsibility for overseeing the investigation and prosecution in critical incidents involving law enforcement officers. The interdependence of county attorneys and law enforcement officers inhibits the ability of county attorneys to hold errant officers accountable. That only one officer in the history of the state of Minnesota is being prosecuted in the death of a community member is ample evidence that this recommendation is far too weak to be effective in holding officers accountable. The recommendations from Police Training Work Group are sound, but would make more robust by a recommendation to prohibit funding for bulletproof warrior-type training. These courses are inflammatory, breed an us versus them mentality, are not based on law enforcement best practices and current thinking, and are often provided by unqualified individuals and organizations. Officer Yanez completed one such course just months before he killed Philando Castile. Training dollars should not be used to reimburse the costs of these courses. One additional recommendation we would bring forward is training in peer intervention such as that provided by International Ethics and Leadership Training Bureau. This training empowers officers to intervene to help fellow officers avoid engaging in conduct that would harm their careers, families, and their lives, as well as the community. To the recommendations of the Community and Law Enforcement Health and Wellness Work Group, we would add a recommendation to increase funding for employee assistance programs for law enforcement officers. Finally, as stated previously, the preliminary report includes no recommendations that directly address the current lack of accountability for officers who engage in misconduct. Without addressing this important element, little progress can be made in the stated goal of the council. Should the council want any additional information on our efforts to increase accountability, improve policing, we will be happy to present this information at a future meeting. For Justice, Michelle Gross from Community United Against Police Brutality. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I want to, while it is all so important, we also really want to be very sensitive to everyone else in the audience, and we ask that you help us do that too. We want to give everybody the opportunity to speak. So we're going to just really ask that people still limit it to 3 minutes. And we will have time at the end too for people to come back up. So we just really ask that on everyone's sake. Thank you.
Next.
Anyone else specific to the recommendations at this point?
I was going to make a comment during the next session. If I made a comment on the recommendations now, that wouldn't preclude that, I take it. I did sign up
Sure.
for the next. One thing I noticed on the first item of the police training work group, in parentheses, includes things like de-escalation strategies. And I'm kind of skeptical about de-escalation strategies. If I came up to the microphone and I had a gun strapped to my hip, and I said, let's talk de-escalation, you'd be somewhat skeptical too, I think. Officers are trained. In fact, the Minneapolis Police Department has a rule that officers have to be at the next level of force beyond which the citizen is at that force level. And since officers have to always be attuned to when the situation requires an escalation, it seems to me we put officers in a very difficult position when we demand that they de-escalate situations at the same time. So it's just a comment that it seems to be a contradictory position that we're putting our officers in. Thank you very much. My name's Chuck Turchik, sorry.
Thank you.
It's a very flexible microphone, doesn't it? My name is Bill Woodson. I'm a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, and I'm also a member of the Roundtable on Restoring Trust Between Community and Policing that was started by Melvin Carter Jr. and Hector Garcia several years ago. We typically meet in North St. Paul. You've already received our 7 recommendations. I'm not going to read them into the record. You can chew on that. I want to respond to, as you requested, the specific recommendations that you've made here, which I will say, after having had some skepticism, I think that the issues that you're trying to address in these recommendations, I think, are by and large the right issues. As I look at recommendations 2, 3, and 4 in particular, which I think very appropriately address the need to bring a more diverse population into law enforcement that is a better reflection of the communities that are being policed. I think that, again, that's the right issue. I think there's some gaps in how these recommendations engage in that issue. The LETO model, which is, I think, an appropriate model for transitioning people who already have a 4-year degree and are already in the workforce, who might be interested in transitioning into law enforcement, I think is an appropriate and useful resource. It does not provide a pathway for young people who are looking at their first career and perhaps providing an access pathway for them. Also, recommendations 3 and 4 look at strategies such as recruiting from outside of the region, recruiting from HBCUs. Again, those aren't necessarily, the root challenge that they're trying to address of diversifying the workforce is an appropriate one, but it's overlooking some approaches that I think could be a better use of limited resources, and they don't deal with the fact that the current brand of law enforcement is very much, as the 21st century policing recommendations in the President's task force talked about, the distinction between a warrior and a guardian mentality, that we have too much of the warrior, not enough of the guardian in the current law enforcement community. That brand is going to continue to draw more warriors and not enough guardians, not enough people who have a social justice mindset, who have a service mindset, who are distinct in their capabilities among the general population, not because of their ability to make a snap decision or to use a weapon or et cetera, but because of their ability to have superior communication skills and superior empathy, which is the guardian mindset that we need more of in law enforcement. That's only going to come when you rebrand what law enforcement is about. And I think there's a great opportunity to both address the under-resourcing of higher education and access for traditionally marginalized communities in general, such as low-income women and people of color, and by investing in educational access for people who want to serve communities in a range of ways, such as social work, such as law enforcement, such as emergency response. It could be a much more efficient way to get to the same root causes, which again, you've identified the challenges, this challenge of not the right mindset and not the right identity to match up optimally with communities. But there's a more efficient pathways, and I have a proposal that I've already developed and have presented to the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota. But there's a need for financial resources, and there's a need for prioritization that could come from the governor's office that would really help to make that proposal move forward, and I'd be happy to further that conversation with you offline.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Mr. Woodson alluded to the fact that he did, you don't have to, you can sit down, alluded to the fact that he did create a document of recommendations, as did Michelle, I can't remember her last name, I'm sorry, but yes. So part of my role, in addition to helping to facilitate the council, is also to facilitate creation of the report. So what I am charged with doing is taking those various documents from stakeholder groups and summarizing them for the council, and then having the documents themselves as appendices as needed, so that information will get to the council members and factor into, the written documentation will factor into the recommendations. Just so you see that link. Yes, please come on.
My name is Mustafa, and I'm gonna talk about what we're missing. I read this, and it's really beautiful. It's nice, but let's face it, I believe it's not going to work, because this has been existing since 1960s. This is the same recommendation. Everybody put a new recommendation, and it's not going to work. And we are 2017, unfortunately. We are talking about this. So what we're missing is the police should be reformed. They need to be changed completely, because they have a very powerful unions, and as long as they have those they've been set up higher standard like everybody else. They don't know they are a public servant. And then as long as we have this kind of powerful unions, all these recommendations, regardless how beautiful they are or how logical they are not going to be implemented, because we need to change how the police unions and how the police behave. And that has to be brought up and changed completely. It might take time, but it's something need to be done. As long as we want to prevent more killing, we need to change the system, because it's a system that strongly support them. As long as the system is there to support them, there's nothing can be done. I'm sorry to say that, but that's a fact, in my opinion. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name's Kenneth Avon. Yeah, and I have a couple of thoughts as well. I think a lot of people, or the people that have gone before me, have talked a lot about some really important things as far as, like, let's start with accountability. There isn't a mention of accountability here, which is very frustrating because, as was stated earlier, it seems like the community has to own part of this problem, and when we're talking about the killings of 2 people specifically, this council was in response to. And so, yeah, I'd like to start with accountability, and I think, but we can't even start there because it seems like we don't even have a real agreement on what the problem is. I don't have, in these recommendations, I don't have really an acknowledgement of what the problem is. Is it police brutality? Is it just the fact that there's no trust? I'm not really sure. It just kind of says where the problems exist in the relationship. And I understand that the objective was to try to rebuild or establish trust, but we need to really talk about why that trust isn't there. And I would venture to guess it's because of the police brutality, but I also venture to guess that it is because of the historic role police have played in different communities, like experiences here in the U.S. When we talk about African Americans and slave catchers, we can talk about our East African communities and what they're experiencing back home, and what a police presence here means for them as well. When we look at our Native communities and what police were told to do in enforcing for Native communities to be moved to reservations, or when we talk about our Latino communities and thinking about what is that interaction with ICE right now? What is that interaction with deportations and things like that? And so I think that's really important to acknowledge. And so when we talk about community and law enforcement, health and wellness work group, I really think we can't talk about social healing and trauma with police officers in the room or whatever it is if they're not also going to be held accountable to the actions that they take. I am happy to see that there's going to be more of an understanding around mental health. I think that's really, really important. I think that's something that has kind of gone unmentioned in a lot of different conversations about police and police community and the relationships with communities. But I do think that mental health and implicit bias, while they're both really important things, we also need to talk about the historic impact police have had on different communities and what that means when they're relating to those communities as well, and what it means to also try to recruit, people from these communities. It's not really a secret or a question as to why communities of color aren't running to become police officers. There's a really bad history and a really negative history there. And so I think we need to really acknowledge that and really agree on what the problem is before we can say cool, here are some solutions.
Thank you. You mentioned a couple things. You talked a lot about accountability. You also talked about the context, the trauma, et cetera. And I just wanted to point out that what you have in your hands is the recommendations themselves. There is the rest of the report that kind of gives more of the context, probably not in the way that you explained it there, but that is not the entire report. There is some narrative about how we came to be to this place.
Hi, my name is Rich Deming. Following up on what Mustafa said about reforming the unions, at this time we have a police chief in Minneapolis, and a mayor who at least seemed to be progressive and more so than some of our legislators, for instance, who would be able to should be able to get rid of difficult, problematic officers, officers who are causing the problems in the community, who are abusing their authority, who are being warriors, acting like warriors, not servants. They need to be able to get rid of those people and fire them over the union's head. And I also like the idea of new officers having to spend at least 20 hours of on-duty time at a local social service agency. What about old officers? What about ongoing officers? Why not have them go through that at least every year? One period of time for every officer every year, spend time at a social service agency. And the idea of police living in the communities they serve is very important, extremely important. If they're going to connect with the communities, they need to live there. So they have some skin in the game, so to speak. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name's Kay Smith, and my husband was killed by the St. Paul Police, so it's really important to me that we work on this issue, but I don't feel that, I think that, I appreciate that you're trying, but it doesn't seem to me that, it seems like most of this is focused on who we hire, and I feel like who we have working right now is the problem. So, there's a little bit about training and stuff like that, but if the people that are in power are not open to the new training, and are not participating in this process, then I don't know how far we're going to get with this. And the problem is, if we have this great plan for hiring and getting good people in, but we're not working on the people that are on the force or the blue line that exists and the people, we see what happened with St. Paul, with the officer that, with the guy who, the $1 million to $2 million lawsuit, and the officer who actually testified against the other officers, he was pushed out of his job. So if we don't work on the culture right now in the police forces with the officers that exist and have been around forever, then how are we really going to make changes? And so I don't see a lot here that's addressing the culture that exists or how we get through. An officer in my husband's case, that I spoke to after my husband died, said that the biggest problem is culture and training right now. And I don't see where we're addressing, I see a small bit on training here, but where we're addressing culture and training. And, I know specifically in Minneapolis, Mike Quinn offered to give for free a training session that helps address that blue line that officers are afraid to cross, where they won't tell on bad behavior that they see in their department. And the Minneapolis police, at least, and he offered to do it for free, and they said that no, they wouldn't allow him to do that training. So if we don't address or start working on that with, and I'm picking on Minneapolis right now, but, St. Paul, I was told that, they wouldn't participate in this process because they couldn't have control over it. So it seems to be another problem with St. Paul, and I don't know much about the other, smaller area law enforcement agencies, but if we're not working on that, and I don't see us addressing that a whole lot in these recommendations, then what good is it to bring on a whole new bunch of young, even if they're ready to go and have a great attitude coming in, how long does it take to ruin that attitude?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Bahia. I just wanted to address number 4 and the last sentence on there. One of the ways of the hiring practices of police officers would be including members of the surrounding community in screening of candidates. That's a great idea, but I was at a previous listening session hosted by NPR where someone was actually on one of those committees, and most of what they recommended for candidates were actually turned away because of criminal history involving drugs. So I'm wondering if there's some way to address that, because we can talk about the systemic oppression that happens that sets up people of color to obtain these types of criminal offenses. So it's a great idea, but if it's not actually being followed through, then what's the point? Because I know that a lot of these things always end up checking off the community box, but then never actually following through. They're like, we address the community, but that's it, and they move on with their lives. So it's a good idea, but it's like, where's the follow-through on that? Because there are people that have been on these panels or whatever of screening candidates, and their like opinions have kind of been pushed off. So
Thank you.
My name's Kevin Gertis, and I'm from the University of Minnesota Humphrey School. I just wanted to say that I do believe that that broadly speaking, these recommendations are focused on the right topics. But my concern is the devil's in the details, because there's a big step between a recommendation of this nature and one that actually gets implemented on the ground. And that's going to take some deliberation, some negotiation, many stakeholders involved. And I'm just curious, I'm concerned and I'm curious and concerned about how that may or may not be taking place or is not planned for being considered down the road in the future. Because I do see, I would imagine that many of these recommendations are going to land and gain the governor's approval and perhaps gain some legislative support for a future policy. And so I would just hope that at some point there's some implementation discussions as well regarding this. And a perfect example is, as I'm reading through these, I could say, yeah, this is great, but how will that work? Or I could envision a policy where it could really go bad or waste money. And a good example is earmarking dollars for reimbursing departments to recruit, to diversify their departments. I think advertisements are not going to get at the core issue, because I think the core issue around that particular topic was addressed by one of our previous speakers, where there's a brand, there's an image that has to change, and I think some money towards the efforts around changing that brand and that culture is not a quick fix, but perhaps that's where the money could be spent to help those communities that right now are resistant. No matter how many advertisements they hear, they're going to continue to be resistant towards coming into the police department. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dee Miller, and I want to thank you, Mr. Burrows, for stating establishing trust. You can't restore something that was never there. So I want to piggyback off a couple other things. The gentleman who just spoke, that's my concern too, is in theory, it looks good. How are we going to get to the enforcement piece? I've been at I was at the NPR one too, but I've been at a lot of local ones. I live on the border of St. Anthony, Roseville, where Officer Yan is the policeman. So I was at a Falcon Heights listening session where the police chief and the Falcon Heights mayor were in my group. And we talked about these things very openly and very, no words were minced. And he took it all in, but then said, well, we have to have more resources. We have to have more resources if you want that. And, we challenged him. Why can't you take, 10 minutes from rifle practice and do de-escalation or, something like that? And, I guess my point is it has to be a buy-in from the top to the bottom, and there has to be recourse. There was complaints against, I don't know if it was Officer Yanez, but a St. Anthony officer previously that the police chief wouldn't listen to or blew off. And so there has to be beyond that. And the mayor is oftentimes the same mentality as the police chief. So it has to be top to bottom buy-in. And I would beg to differ with this gentleman about de-escalation. It's a very, very important thing to train. And if you want to see, I'm not a positive person about all this, but there are pockets throughout the country. And the New York Times, on the April 2nd, New York Times had an article about Camden, New Jersey. I don't know if anybody saw that. The most dangerous city in the country has the murder rate of El Salvador. And they somehow got the union to buy in, which is all, we all know is the issue. And they have turned that around. The police chief, they de-escalate, they showed videos of, in this article about how they de-escalated certain things, how they do things differently, and it's made a huge difference. So there are pockets that I think we need to use from around the country in order to mandate change in other departments, big departments, and then have that move down. But I love the volunteering part too. The St. Cloud police chief mandates that his officers, before he hires them, they have to have a history of volunteering in their community.
Just a few seconds, sir.
Thank you.
Perfect,
Thank you.
perfect. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Malini. So I will agree to a lot of the things that have been said earlier. I think these policies are cool, but the reality is that, yes, we do need to address the underlying issues that a lot of these communities are facing, and we need to start talking about the history. Because in all reality, I have had the opportunity to work in these spaces. I have had the opportunity to work in law enforcement spaces. I had the opportunity to go to college, get a criminal justice degree, and I also had the opportunity to interact with these communities. Because I come from a community that doesn't never get the opportunity to be a part of the system and be a part of making policy or making changes. And also, when I was in these spaces, it was very difficult for me to feel welcome or feel like I belonged there, right? I was one of very few people of color. I was the only woman at times. So I think we need to start talking about these things, right? Because we can, start creating scholarships or paths towards a future for people to be in the criminal justice system. But if I don't feel like I belong in that space, I don't want to be pressured into being there, right? Like someone said earlier, we need to start talking about creating paths towards social work, towards addressing underlying issues, right? And again, I think, like these policies are here and they're cool, but I don't know how much change we're gonna see knowing that it's systematic. It's much more than this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, all of the above. It's being taped, and there are people who are sitting here taking notes, taking it very seriously. Thank you. Any other comments about or questions about the recommendations?
Somebody over here.
Okay.
My name is Bob Tracy, and we've heard issues around the systemic causes that exist within the criminal justice system, the law enforcement system. We've heard issues about accountability. We've heard the importance of paying attention to the details, that oftentimes that's where the devil is. These recommendations are very enthusiastic when it comes to existing legislation to increase training for law enforcement and to establish the pathway programs. But the concerns about systemic issues, the concerns that have been expressed about accountability apply to the details here. I'm very concerned about this group's enthusiasm for those recommendations because the training that's being proposed is all controlled by law enforcement. The terms for that training is established by law enforcement. And even when the community sought opportunity to have some sort of input to establish accountability, their recommendations were rejected. It had to be controlled and provided only on the terms of law enforcement. That's the systemic problem. But when it came to the Pathways program, sitting in the hearing, a lawmaker asked, what was the impact of this program? They'd never had a person of color effectively go through the program. But do you see this legislation requiring any sort of reporting that demonstrates its impact on creating opportunities for people of color or women to come into law enforcement? None of it is there. The accountability doesn't exist. So, systemic issues, the accountability issues are very powerful. There's great enthusiasm for training and creating pathways for new people to come into law enforcement or to change how they approach law enforcement. When the terms are only established by law enforcement about what that training looks like, and when there's no accountability on the other end, then why invest those dollars? So I think that the group has to look closely at even its enthusiasm for what might seem like a consensus recommendation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Additional thoughts?
I do want to make one comment. I just want to thank you again for everybody making room for everybody that's in this room that wants to speak. So I want to thank you for that. So would anyone else like to speak?
If there, oh, I'm sorry.
Somebody? Yep.
Just a few points quickly. First of all, I think you need more hearing sessions with more information out to the community, and one in Greater Minnesota is not going to do something when there's almost 600 miles difference between places in the state. In no particular order, lack of concern about, well, I'm not gay, I work with a lot of gay problems, and there's nothing that I see about the LGBT community, which has a lot of problems with their youth and police. Another issue that was brought first to me by a former trainer for the Minneapolis cops is the fact that they don't get training anymore annually or semi-annually, and it's even less in the suburbs, on use of force without guns. As almost all my friends on the police force said in Minneapolis, if Jamar Clark had happened 20 years ago, he'd have bruises but not be dead. And in fact, just last Saturday, I was talking to a group of cops, present ones, and they said, yes, even and more in the suburbs, but there's too much resort to use of guns immediately as the only way to control a situation that's starting to get out of hand. While diversity is really important, it's also even more important according to national studies in schools showing the teachers the diversity isn't as important as training of teachers on how to work with different cultures. Somebody else brought up getting out in the community and knowing them is probably a huge importance. And those are the just quick points.
Thank you.
If there are no other comments, I did not speak to him about this, but Mr. Burrows, if you would like to respond briefly, I want to give you an opportunity. If not, then that's fine. Okay. So the next thing that we will do is open, we have 8 people, I believe it is, Omar?
10, he said.
Oh, 10, okay, who have signed up to give a response, and we have the list.
Oh. We'll ask if we need. Professor Nancy, come on up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and for the opportunity to speak today about an additional and relevant aspect of policing, of fair policing. I'm a professor at Augsburg College right here.
They're not hearing you. They're not hearing.
They're not hearing me. Professors are used to being heard, so I'll speak more loudly too. I'm a professor right here at Augsburg College, but important to this issue, I've also for decades been an eyewitness scientist. Along with colleagues nationally and internationally, we have put together evidence base that is good science practice relevant for fair police practice in identification lineups. This is a particularly important issue because we can see from national statistics that, for example, if you look at the DNA exoneration cases from the Innocence Project, these are people who have been wrongfully convicted. 70 to 75% of them, they involved a mistaken eyewitness identification, which is a horrible indictment of of eyewitnesses. But here's the point that I want to make that I think is so relevant to today's discussion. And if you look at those cases, 41% were cross-racial IDs. We know from our research that humans are inherently poor at making identifications of strangers they've seen for only a short time when it comes to a police lineup. A witness is 1.5 times more likely to pick the wrong person, make a mistaken identification from a lineup if the incident was cross-race, that is, trying to identify someone of another race. So here's the important point. We have good, scientifically based, low-cost procedures that can help diminish the likelihood of that type of phenomenon occurring. The core 4 that we call them includes such simple procedures as making sure that the lineup is developed properly. That is, there's only one suspect in the lineup and the rest are known innocent fillers. That helps catch unreliable witnesses to make certain that an identification, the evidence you get from an identification lineup is reliable. A blind lineup administrator, that is, the officer in the case detective shouldn't be in the room when that identification is made, because we want to make sure that we're relying on eyewitness memory, and that's the only thing. We have proper instructions that we've scientifically demonstrated helps reduce the risk of identification error and subsequently wrongful conviction. And finally, there's a recommendation, the 4th one of the core 4, to take a confidence statement from a witness at the time that that identification is made. These are really simple, low-cost procedures, and they can very much help reduce the incidence of misidentification and subsequent wrongful conviction. This is not part of your current recommendations, but it's really relevant to the point of, oops, I think it went away now. It's relative to the objectives as well in terms of justice and good police practice. But I think I was looking specifically at the task force on, there it is, the police training work group. And I hope that as that group goes forward, they will continue to keep this in mind because it's again, a kind of a simple process that can help our police to do better work on behalf of all citizens.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bill Woodson. Okay.
Hi, Chuck Turchik. Thank you for hearing me again. I noticed that the first duty listed in the executive order establishing this council is to, quote, advise the governor, legislators, and other policymakers and stakeholders about the immediate actions which can be taken in Minnesota to create and restore trust between communities and their law enforcement agencies, unquote. The decline in trust for law enforcement among certain communities is not a new phenomenon. The lack of trust has roots that go way back. I've seen a decline in trust in the last half century, and it probably goes back at least another century before that. There is no single solution to establishing that trust. There's no silver bullet, which is probably not the best metaphor. Unfortunately, you could implement all of your recommendations and have no effect on the level of trust. I feel one important item was not included. If I were to do just one thing to improve community trust in law enforcement, it would be to increase the transparency in the processes by which officers are held accountable when citizens make complaints, whether that's through internal affairs or some kind of civilian oversight. Everyone is for transparency. In Minneapolis, Police Chief Harto's MPD 2.0 model of policing is premised on, quote, commitment, integrity, transparency, unquote. The promoters of the current civilian oversight process in Minneapolis claimed it would bring greater transparency. In discussion leading up to the adoption of the body-worn cameras, the president of the Police Officers Federation of Minneapolis called for the greatest accessibility and transparency for the public of body camera footage. Everyone wants transparency, certainly the citizens do. But because of state statutes, transparency is lacking in the process of determining the validity of citizens' complaints about police officer conduct. The Minnesota Data Practices Act severely limits such transparency. If you could do one thing to increase trust in law enforcement, it would be to make allegations against police officers exempt from the provisions of that act. Maybe it could be justified on the basis that law enforcement officers are unique in that they are given the authority to use legal force. Or maybe the unbelievably low level of trust in law enforcement within certain communities could justify such an exception. Some states do in fact allow more open review processes. For example, in Georgia, the Atlanta Citizen Review Board has the discretion to hold public hearings regarding complaints against police officers.
Just a few more seconds, Chuck.
I'm in my last paragraph.
Thank you.
And may even choose to deliberate on their cases in sessions open to the public. That would not be legal in Minnesota. I don't know of any organization calling for this change, but trust without transparency and the accountability process is illusory. The Data Practices Act could be changed, but it would take some body, such as this one, calling for it to happen. I urge you to include it in your recommendations. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry if I went over.
No, thank you, thank you.
Kay Smith? Is Kay Smith still here? Oh, you already talked,
Oh,
okay.
thank you.
BDHIEH, I don't want to. Bahia.
Butcher.
Thank you.
I just have a question about, so I'm Bahia and I'm a community organizer on the west side. I was wondering what community organizations you have connected with about this, because the community organizations, and especially communities with a high percentage of people of color, are like the experts of their community because they're run by the community. So I was wondering which organizations you've reached out to, especially in St. Paul, and I'm talking about like the west side and the east side, Payne-Phelan area too as well. So that's one of my questions. And then if these listening sessions, if they're happening at different locations, and if there's a possibility of having one on the west side, it's an area that's been historically forgotten by the city of St. Paul, historically forgotten by due to essentially white supremacy, because it's been an area that has displaced the native folks that live there, that has displaced the immigrants that were forced there, that has like forced communities of colors to be in that area. So I was hoping that that could be something looked at for having a listening session on the west side. And then I was wondering if there's talk about explicitly talking about the relationship between not ICE and undocumented folks, but the relationship between undocumented folks and the police when they're pulled over. There's from not listening sessions, but from discussions I've had with Ramsey County and SPPD, they keep saying that they're not going to change anything because apparently what they're doing is working, which we know it's not. So maybe including stuff that's explicitly talking about undocumented folks and their experiences that they have being pulled over by police. So yeah.
So I'm going to take your first two as questions and the third as potentially a recommendation. So the first one was who's involved?
Yeah, which
and there are,
community
the council is made up
organizations?
of a representation from law enforcement as well as from people from community-based organizations. I cannot speak specifically to whether there's, Mr. Burrows, if you could speak to if there's anyone from the west side who's represented on the council.
No, I don't think any of the West Side organizations are there, but your offer to have a listening session there, let's meet with my staff, Omar and others. We'd love to have one over the West Side.
So just tentatively, we're thinking another one in the Twin Cities yet to be determined, so it sounds like the west side, and then potentially one in Duluth and somewhere in the south part of the state.
And one of the things I want to say too as well, there'll be formal listening sessions. There'll be 3 more of those at least. there are ways that we still can reach out to those communities as well by having people, my staff, go over there and have community meetings as well. So it may not look like this with all the mics, but I do want to have that input as well. So we'll make sure that happens.
Mayor Melanie? Yes, you've already, okay. Casey? I pass, okay. Mustafa, who's spoken. Did you want to speak again, Mustafa? Not really. Okay. Deidre?
So I'm looking at the executive order from Governor Dayton on the second page. Very, very long list. Almost the whole alphabet of representatives from particular organizations. And I realize that on print, very much like all of these papers that you have put out, things look good in theory. This really does not represent the communities that have been very, very adversely affected by white supremacy, by police brutality, use of excessive force. And what I would like to recommend is that listening sessions, that there's more than 3, that they're in different neighborhoods, and that they are at least 2 weeks out planned, because you're dealing with families and it's got to be after 5. There are people who work who are affected by these issues. Also, I believe that some of these organizations that are listed here have an agreement that is being followed from 2001. It's 2017. This is 16 years. And Jamar Clark and Philando Castile are not the only 2 people who have been affected. Even in the last weeks, there's been murder of Cordell Handy up on the east side. There have been a number, Frank Baker, that's $2 million. I'm very curious about funding of paying out officers for officers' wrongdoing. I think we need to talk about money coming out of police officers' pension or having the police officers insured. This money cannot come out of taxpayers' pockets any longer. And I feel really perverse talking about money, but I realize that all of these nice papers and everyone who's paid to be here looks at the bottom line. So that I'm talking your speak, but what I'm talking about as a mother is this is disgusting. If all of the work that you have done since 2001 and all of the promises that have been made in print are the same, you're not doing something right. And the people notice, and we're watching, and we want bigger listening sessions, and we want listening sessions on the people's community comfort level. You need to go to the community. You need to show the community that you are committed to following through. Because if it has not happened by now, we all are in deep trouble. You know why? Because it's May. It's protesting season. The legislation that's happening.
Just a few more seconds.
Yeah, you know what? I especially want you to listen to this one. Because as far as protesting and the protesting bills that are happening, we are looking at a bloody summer with everything that's happened. And I want you to take that home personally, because this is not going away. We need sessions where people are going to be brought together for real and heard.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm done.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, Mustafa. Do we go through the?
Nope, Carmen.
Oh, Mustafa, he was on the list previously, so you can go ahead.
Yes, if you'd like to speak.
Yeah, but I can leave somebody's stuff.
You can come up and speak.
All right. I want to take the whole time, but I'm just kidding now. what I will recommend is really, I was thinking about what everybody's talking, accountability have been mentioned many times. And so my question is, how come can you guys set up independent prosecutor, somebody who are independent? That person can look at every police conduct. And I don't think it's a good idea the CBA, they sometimes investigate, PCA, I think PCA. Yeah, PCA, yeah, sure, thanks. I don't think they are transparent. And so if you want to change the system, like I said before, it's a systematic. And if you want to make it different for a good attention, which I believe your word, you guys are doing it, but you have to tackle what is the problem is, and she mentioned, the sister here, you have to go to the communities, not like this small. You need to every community center in Twin Cities and open a public discussion about this issue so people have to say something. You know, you have a small number here, 20, 30 people, that's not enough. And you're gonna put the news, oh, we did a community session, it was successful listening. It's not, it's only you have 10, 20 people. So you have to go to the, get out your comfort zone, go to the communities and share all this information so every member of the community has to hear and listen their conversation and then make a better recommendation than this one, because this one, like I said, been existing since 1960s, just to keep changing few words. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
The last name we have on the list is Carmen.
Foster?
Oh, yes.
Hi, my name is Carmi Ann Foster.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're fine, it's complicated. But I work with justice system involved youth, and they're often excluded from these types of conversations. But unfortunately, they're also the ones who most frequently come into contact with law enforcement and who may have the most negative experiences. But they're not going to be the kids you get by having a youth council involved on your board, or even, quite frankly, sometimes by inviting them places you might have to go to, the juvenile detention centers or to the evening reporting centers in the counties. And it's just important to me, as one of the people who's helping them to get back on track and to have positive ways to express their voice, to make sure that we're inviting them to these tables as well, where they might not traditionally be seen. Thanks.
Thank you.
That is all that we have for the list of folks who have registered who signed up to speak. Are there others who would like to speak? Yeah, please.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak again. I just wanted to talk about 3 additional things. One, I wanted to reiterate the importance of accountability. I think accountability really, really needs to be a part of this conversation. And I think it's important to have this conversation and talk about money. So I appreciate, even though you felt uncomfortable talking about it, I think that's, where we need to start. And like, where is the money coming from when we talk about lawsuits against police and things around the state that are happening. The second thing I want to talk about here is, if you go back to the slide with the objectives, cool. So yeah, if you go to here, I see a lot like, establish, rebuild, trust, focus on procedural, social justice. I guess I'm a little frustrated by the fact that there isn't a conversation around like, how do we just decrease the interactions between police and our different communities? I think that, that's a real place to start when we're talking about like, how do we establish trust? Like, we don't need people to be constantly observed, all the oversight, all of the policing that takes place of specific communities. I think we really need to have this conversation around yes, we want to try to establish more trust, but also we need to figure out how do we not disproportionately scrutinize, disproportionately arrest, have interactions with different communities of color. And I think we need to seriously have those conversations when we do have police at the table. I know it's like uncomfortable, it's difficult that sometimes police don't want to have these conversations and we don't think we're gonna get anywhere, but we actually do need to have those conversations. And whether or not they're happening on the council, I honestly don't know, and I'm not gonna pretend like I do, but I think this is an opportunity where police are at the table, they have to be at the table according to this executive order, and we should be talking about what does accountability look like and how can we make sure that police aren't over policing specific communities, and how do we overall decrease the interactions, because we don't need a new prison built, right? We don't need all of our prisons to be filled to capacity. That just feels like we're just trying to push an industry as opposed to like figuring out what's healthy for our communities. And finally, I really think we do need to take a look at police in schools and like what are the specific things that we need to address about police in schools, and why is that interaction different than interactions with police on the streets? In a lot of ways they aren't different, to be honest. Like you have specific schools that have police in them, but also we need to think about this being such a vulnerable population. What additional measures do we need to take to make sure that students are feeling safe, are feeling secure in their schools so that they can optimize their learning? So I think those are the three things to take away as I think that are missing. We really need to talk about accountability. We really need to talk about what are the effects of over-policing and how can we reduce the interactions between specific communities and police and just overall. And then finally, like, what are we doing also about police in schools?
Thank you very, very much.
Anyone else would like to? Yeah.
I'm glad we came back to this slide, because I do think there's just a primal foundational piece that we kind of are looking past as we think about, broad directions like focusing on procedural and social justice. I mean, there's nothing wrong with those things, but at the end of the day, my heart is broken, and and breaks every time another citizen dies at the hands of a police officer. And of course, we're frustrated and concerned and saddened when, criminals, hurt and kill our citizens. But when the people who are charged with keeping our citizens safe instead are ending their lives in situations that seems like there should have been another path, we should just have as a society, a lot stronger passion for getting to that strategy for preventing the next one. And we just seem as a society to lack that passion. And I would love to see the state of Minnesota be a leader in the nation in having a spark of passion for stopping the next one. And I just wanted to say that. And then the second piece, and it goes to accountability. And it's been mentioned in brief, but I just want to reinforce the point. There's a simple dollar and cent based strategy for addressing repeated poor behavior, bad decision making on the part of law enforcement. And it's individual liability insurance that's carried by police officers. There's nothing wrong with that strategy other than it drives the unions crazy and they fight it. There's no reason to not do that. It doesn't have to change the top line at all. Bump up, if it's $1,000 a year, bump up police salaries by $1,000 a year. And if they have repeated bad behavior, the insurance company is going to take care of making it impossible for those officers to continue to be policemen, and they need to be pushed out anyway, since Chief Hartow and others don't seem to be able to figure out how to manage that. Let the dollars and cents, we're a dollars and cents community. Let that solve it. The only reason that idea has zero traction is because of the power of the unions. And if we're serious about changing police behavior, there's a strategy right at our fingertips that's very simple in terms of logistics to implement. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Anyone else?
So in addition to my role in working with youth, I was also a program coordinator for Dakota County for quite a while. And so a concern that probably will not come up in this inner city circle, but that is of particular importance in our suburban communities, is the perception of people of color by individuals who do not often get an opportunity to interact with them. In Dakota County, if you come into contact with law enforcement, it's either you were speeding on the road or someone called on you. And so educating our community members who may not be exposed to diversity on a regular basis about having diverse individuals around them and about the belonging of everyone in Minnesota. When you receive phone calls to law enforcement because there's African American teenagers playing basketball at a park, there's a problem. And that really goes beyond necessarily what recommendations are going to be able to address and speaks to the way that our society sees people of color generally. But the recommendations, I would hope, need to address that underlying racial tension within our community. And it may not be Minnesota nice to include it, but it is important. Thank you.
Well, if there's no one else, I think we'll close this listening session. I just wanted to say I appreciate the transparency of a theme that's come up quite a bit in our discussion. I appreciate everyone who's come up and been transparent and I think vulnerable and honest in sharing their perspectives in a what is not an easy conversation. And moving forward, just to reiterate what we're doing, we are, so my role, again, as I said, is part facilitator and part kind of working with the council members to help write the report. So someone will be drafting the notes from this session that will go to the council members and be considered along with the written documents that we received and be incorporated into the final report. I see that as, I think the end of June is our timeline. So what you've seen so far is just sort of a first pass at recommendations. I want you to make sure that you understand that we're nowhere near done, that we're looking at redrafting and adding a lot more meat to the existing recommendations, and you're a big part of that. And I appreciate you taking your time and coming out and sharing with us this evening. Sure. And I am not the person to ask that. Do we know the answer to that question?
Before the end of the week, we'll have it posted. You're welcome.
That has been noted, but if you want to.
It's been noted. I can't commit to that today, but we will give more lead time so parents can make arrangements. And we're also too considering to identify some funding for childcare as well. So we'll make every attempt to be 10 days out for the meeting. So that's the goal, 10 days out.
And I thank you everyone for coming, and we will be on the lookout for our next upcoming listening sessions.
Thank you very much.